Now we've learnt about clocks and rates, let's look at what we can actually look at when we're studying evolutionary rates. So these approaches can tell us the rate of change of DNA or of morphology, or both if we so wish. The context we have here when it comes to thinking about rates, as represented by this beautiful movie poster from 1992, I believe, that in itself is becoming something of a historical artifact. Up to the 1970s, biologists and paleontologists basically assumed that evolutionary change occurred on the whole gradually. New species branched off from their ancestors slowly, and that was very much the picture that had been in place since the formalization of the theory of evolution in the mid-1800s. Now, of course, since we can derive rates with these new phylogenetic approaches, we have been able to test whether that is true and whether evolution is, in fact, gradual or whether rates can change. Okay, so let's meet an example which can illustrate the intersection of rates with a really important evolutionary event. And let's start by looking at the Cambrian explosion. So you may remember the Cambrian explosion from our milestones in evolution content. This occurred at 542 million years ago, where suddenly modern animal phyla appear quickly in the fossil record. And there are some examples of those fossils that appear very shortly after the beginning of the Cambrian period on the slide here. And I mentioned in Milestones in Evolution, there's been an ongoing debate regarding whether that was an artifact of the fossil record, for example, the opening of a taphonomic window, a preservational window whereby suddenly organisms that were there before are being preserved, or whether it's a real event which would imply that it had to have elevated rates of evolution for all of these things to suddenly appear. This is a perfect situation in which we can use Bayesian phylogenetic approaches and rates to understand what was going on during this singular event in evolution. So I actually introduced this paper from 2013, which I think is a really beautiful example in the Milestones in Evolution content, but we can now understand it a little better. We can understand how it works. So this study uses phylogenetic clock methods with both molecular and morphological character data to study the rates of evolution during the origins of a major group of animals called the arthropods, which we're going to meet in a bit more detail later in this series of videos. The tree that these authors recover is shown on the left-hand side here. That tree they use to analyze rates, and the rates they derive from that tree are shown in the graphs on the right-hand side here. So what these authors do is they assume an origin in the Ediacaran period for these animals, and by doing so, they show that phenotypic, so that's morphological evolution, was about 4 times faster, and molecular evolution, shown on the top right here, was about 5.5 times faster during the Cambrian explosion than it was during the rest of the time period that has elapsed since the Cambrian. They also show that that rapid evolutionary rate was robust to the assumptions about the precise age of origins of this group that fed into the analysis. So that assumption didn't have much impact on the rates that they recover. And also that those rates, the ones that are shown in these graphs here during the Cambrian explosion, while they're elevated, are within the range demonstrated in empirical examples from the world today of normal evolutionary processes. So this wasn't something that was outside the realm of what happens today, but it was very, very fast evolution, and it was indeed an explosion. So it's a really nice example of how a study that uses rates can help us understand a major event in the fossil record. And so this, in 2013, was suggesting that the Cambrian explosion was indeed an explosion. But wait, there's more. On the left-hand side is a figure from a recent paper that uses some of the latest methods for analyzing the rates of evolution of morphology. The authors of this study applied those methods to a large new data set of Cambrian trilobites. This is a group of the arthropods, the most abundant and diverse group of organisms that were alive during this time. And so they've used this morphological data to derive a tree showing the relationships between the trilobites that were alive during the Cambrian period, but also to analyze the rates using a range of different models that are shown in different colors here for for these trilobites. And they actually show which is really interesting, that the rates of evolution in these early trilobites are virtually identical to those throughout their Cambrian fossil history. And this suggests that those elevated rates of evolution that were identified in the 2013 paper had finished in trilobites at least by the time the typical Cambrian fossil record commences at about 521 million years ago. So this really actually suggests this is a very, very explosive explosion. A modern style marine biosphere seems to have emerged rapidly over a period of about 20 million years during the latest Ediacaran period and the earliest Cambrian. So by the time we start seeing the fossils and we start doing this analysis, all of the evolution of that ecosystem had occurred. Now, another way we can assess the nature of the Cambrian explosion is through trace fossils. And this second paper from 2025 that I reference on the slide here, and from which I took this diagram on the right, shows the evolution of behavior through trace fossils. These are the records of behaviors like burrowing that are preserved in the rock record. And in this paper, the authors quantified the appearance of a number of different behaviors across the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary. And they collected from a site in Newfoundland a series of different of pieces of evidence of different types of burrowing in different onshore to offshore locations in Newfoundland. They recognize in this study through their work that burrowing is an important factor in the Cambrian explosion. And they highlight that this is an example of ecosystem engineering. This is when organisms modify the environment for both themselves and others. And they highlight that the evolution of this behavior may have been a core part of the Cambrian explosion. That work further suggests that those animal behaviors appear first in the lower offshore sediments, right at the end of the Ediacaran, and then expanded inshore, facilitating an evolutionary event that would be the thing that we recognize as the Cambrian explosion in the body fossil record. Their work further supports this unique nature of the Cambrian explosion and the idea that changes to the sediment thanks to animals were important, and that this is a unique event in the history of life. So that's really, really interesting. But we can also ask ourselves, outside of unique events like this, is evolution gradual, or rather, is it something else? As I said, people used to think that actually evolution was typified by gradual change. But this all changed, and in particular, a watershed event happened in 1972 with a piece of work published by Gould and Eldridge, the reference I've put on the slide for you here, which I wanted to finish this video by introducing. So in general, we've already met the idea that evolution can proceed via anagenesis or cladogenesis, anagenesis being change in a lineage through time, whereas cladogenesis being a point at which a new species appear and lineages split. Okay, so there's a distinction between how evolution can proceed in terms of whether it's just gradually changing or whether it's splitting into multiple different species. But we can also map those two types of evolution to styles of either gradual change that is shown on the top here, or to bursts of evolution, which we can see on the bottom here, whereby change will be concentrated into these bursts we can call punctuations, and these punctuations are punctuating stasis, so periods of non-change. In the fossil record, we tend to see cladogenesis. So this is the right-hand side of this graph that we see here. So let's focus on that, and let's focus on these two models. In the top model, this is a world where we have phyletic gradualism, gradual change, and in cladogenic change with phyletic gradualism, we would expect lineages to gradually shift away from each other, change taking place at a fairly constant rate, and speciation will be a side effect of gradual evolution. What Eldridge and Gould suggested, however, which was relatively controversial at the time and has been mulled upon by scientists ever since and researched quite heavily, is that they made the suggestion that most change For example, the morphology that we see in the fossil record is associated with cladogenic, so speciation events, and lineages show relatively little evolution in between those events. So their species through time are largely evolved by stasis that's punctuated by speciation events associated with rapid evolutionary change. Okay, so another way of putting that is that Eldredge and Gould argued that the fossil record does not show evolution occurring in speciation lineages. Most species are defined by stasis over long spans of time with those occasional changes of punctuations. Certainly on the right-hand side, you can see a classic example here of a lineage that shows stasis. This is a horseshoe crab, and these organisms, while they're not a species, there are a few species of these organisms, they do show remarkable stasis. They are virtually unchanged through the Ordovician period through to today in terms of their gross morphology. So this, the authors, Eldredge and Gould, used to support this idea that species and higher level lineages are really defined by stasis through time. This is, however, a tricky thing to test. Because if you think about it, that dynamic could be an artifact of the fossil record, as shown by this diagram on the left-hand side here. This is an idea that was first seeded with Charles Darwin's observations of gaps in the fossil record. If we have a gradual shift through time, but we only sample that twice in 2 fossil sampled intervals, we may see that as stasis with a punctuation between those 2 fossil discoveries. And so really what we may expect, if you have small changes building up during a preserved species duration, but then a gap in the deposition of that rock, the change would accrue during that gap, and that would be observed as a discontinuity in sedimentary rocks and thus the fossil record. So Eldredge and Gould were aware of this, and they pointed out that to test punctuated equilibrium, you would need A, abundant fossil specimens to be able to see gradual change. B, you would need fossils with living representatives so that species could be identified clearly. You would need C, information on geographic variation so that rapid speciation events, punctuations, could be distinguished from migrations in or out of an area. And D, finally, you would need good stratigraphic control. You'd need long, continuous sequences of rocks without gaps and with an abundant fossil record throughout, and good dating to really be able to identify punctuations as opposed to this disjunct that you can see here. And since that publication by Eldredge and Gould in 1972, we've really struggled to get kind of that level of evidence that we would like. Sampling is generally not extensive enough to be able to say anything for sure about the nature of punctuated equilibria. Indeed, even in our best examples, there is still room for questioning. So an example of this is shown on the right-hand side. So this is a study from Williamson in 1981 that was based on hundreds of thousands of specimens of snails and bivalves in sediments deposited in the Lake Turkana area of Kenya between 1.3 and 4.5 million years ago. In that original paper, through this beautiful and extensive sampling, the authors made the case that stasis was common in the species that they studied, and that rapid morphological shifts had taken place 3 times, as shown in this diagram on the right-hand side here. However, restudy since that point has argued strongly that the 3 apparent speciation shifts are actually invasion events, and that those occurred when flooding episodes allowed bivalves and gastropods to enter the lakes from nearby rivers. And so actually the punctuations that we're seeing there are not necessarily evolutionary events, they may be migratory ones. And certainly these concerted shifts that you see into different lineages could be the results of not all of those evolving into new lineages at the same time. If you want to see a recent assessment which highlights what evidence and modeling of evolution can tell us. See this 2025 paper that I've referenced on the slide. That paper makes the case that random walks seem more common in the fossil record than stasis is, but the stasis is also present. But there's certainly lots of room for exciting research to clarify the strength of punctuated equilibrium as a pattern that we see in evolution over large timescales as opposed to phyletic grammaticalism. More recent studies, as we've learned about with the Red Queen, show us that evolution happens on many levels, and overall, I think that probably applies to punctuated equilibrium. So this is me giving you my opinion now, and my opinion is that probably both stasis and punctuational models remain consistent with adaptive evolution in the face of unstable environments. For example, we can imagine there can be a great deal of backwards and forwards movement at a small scale as species evolve to match their environment, say, but that averages out to only moderate long-term change in lots of different lineages of life. Note that that doesn't mean that if, in this case, we have stasis, that there is no evolution. A population can be constantly reacting to environmental shifts, but remain the same species over time through genetic change. And that may occur over periods of, say, 1 million years or so, but it's just not change that's uniform in any given direction. So we may not even see it in the fossil record. And an idea that I find very attractive, actually, is that as well as then seeing broader scale changes we can recognize in the fossil record over longer time periods, but maybe we see differences in the trends between phyletic gradualism and punctuated equilibrium based on the environment and the group of organisms that we're looking at. And this could be associated with, for example, their mode of life. For example, we might expect microfossil groups, such as the foraminifera, shown on the right-hand side here, which are to demonstrate gradual patterns of evolution and speciation as they float in a broad ocean that changes relatively slowly. They just gradually change through time to keep up with their changing environments. But in contrast to that, we may expect sexually reproducing species, such as those organisms shown on the left-hand side here. These are crustaceans that live in ever-changing environments where barriers may be established, and indeed there may be rapid changes in the environmental conditions. We may expect in those conditions punctuations to be more common. So maybe what we've got here is a mixture of these two dynamics over different timescales and in different organism groups. That may, of course, well impact or reflect different modes of speciation that we've seen elsewhere in this course. It may be, of course, that maybe the differences between sympatric and allopatric speciation also are reflected in differences between punctuated and phyletic and gradual change. So really, we've got this broad, multifaceted and complex situation where actually macroevolutionary dynamics are quite hard to pin down in the real world, and there's lots of scope for more exciting research to try and better reveal those. But that's it for video number 3, and I'll see you shortly in video number 4, where we're going to be talking about adaptive radiations.